picture this. Deep in the bowels of the Nightfort, the oldest and most haunted castle on the wall, a massive white rat scurries through the darkness. Its eyes gleam with an intelligence that should not belong to any beast. It hungers, but the only food it can consume is the flesh of its own children. The offspring it devours today will be replaced by tomorrow. This was once a man, a cook who served an Andal king a pie so delicious that the monarch asked for a second helping, never knowing he was eating his own son. Tonight, we gather not to discuss the grand histories written by Maesters in their towers, not the official accounts that fill the libraries of the Citadel with their careful documentation of kings and battles, of treaties signed and lands conquered. No, tonight we turn our attention to something else entirely, something that lives in the margins of history, in the gaps between what is officially recorded and what is actually remembered. To understand why these tales exist outside the official histories, we must first understand something about the men who write those histories. The Maesters of the Citadel pride themselves on their scholarship, their careful documentation of events great and small. They forge their chains link by link, each metal representing a different field of knowledge. They study the stars, they mix medicines, they keep the records of noble houses and maintain the great libraries of learning. But for all their wisdom, for all their dedication to preserving knowledge, there are stories they will not write down. Not because these tales lack truth, but because they lack the pedigree of proper witnesses, the confirmation of noble sources, or perhaps because they reveal truths that educated men find uncomfortable. The Maesters, you see, concern themselves primarily with the affairs of lords and kings. They document battles and treaties, marriages and murders, the rise and fall of dynasties. A maester in a castle serves his lord, records that lord's correspondence, tends to that lord's health, tutors that lord's children. The small folk who work the land, who labour in the kitchens, who muck out the stables and mend the walls, these people exist in their writings only as numbers, as faceless masses who till fields or carry spears when called to war. But the small folk have their own history, their own way of remembering. Where the Maesters have books, the common people have stories passed from grandmother to grandchild, tales told in taverns and around cooking fires, songs sung while working in the fields. These oral traditions preserve truths that would otherwise vanish, though they often preserve them in forms the Citadel would dismiss as superstition or folklore. Consider Old Nan of Winterfell, that ancient woman who served House Stark for so long that she could not recall which Brandon Stark she had first come to nurse. She was so old that Lord Eddard Stark remembered her being called Old Nan, even when he was a boy. Her stories entertained the Stark children through countless long northern nights. She told them of the Long Night and the White Walkers, of the children of the forest and the giants, of the Age of Heroes and all the legends of the North. The Maesters would have smiled indulgently at Old Nan's tales, dismissing them as the colourful inventions of an ancient mind, stories to frighten children and teach simple moral lessons. They might have acknowledged that some kernel of truth lay buried in the legends, but would insist the fantastic elements were mere embellishment. Yet Old Nan's stories about the White Walkers, the very stories that made the learned men of the Citadel shake their heads in amusement, turned out to be more accurate than any Maester's skeptical treatise. The others did exist. The Long Night was real. The ancient woman who could barely remember which generation of Stark she served knew truths that the wisest scholars of Westeros had dismissed as impossible. This is the power and the importance of the stories the Maesters don't record. They preserve knowledge in forms that survive when parchment rots and libraries burn. They carry warnings across generations, encoding practical wisdom in memorable narrative. A smallfolk mother might not be able to explain the strategic importance of guest right to her child, but she can tell him about the rat cook, and that child will never forget that violating the sacred laws of hospitality brings divine punishment. The tales we explore tonight are not frivolous entertainment, though they certainly entertain. They are not mere superstition, though they often involve supernatural elements. They are the living memory of a people, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who learned hard lessons and found ways to ensure their descendants would remember. They are history as told by those who lived it, who suffered through it, who survived to warn others. So let us look past what the Maesters record in their great books. Let us listen instead to what is whispered in the north on cold winter nights, what is sung in the taverns of the Iron Islands, what is murmured in the Reach when the highborn are not listening. These stories endure because they matter, because they contain truths worth preserving, even if they wear the garb of legend. And there is no place in all of Westeros with a darker collection of these whispered tales than the Nightfort. This massive fortress, oldest and largest of all the castles on the wall, was abandoned 200 years ago, its garrison relocated to the more manageable Deep Lake to the east. Queen Alysanne Targaryen convinced the Night's Watch to abandon it during her visit to the wall, for even riding her dragon's Silverwing, even with all the power and prestige of the Iron Throne behind her, she found the Nightfort unbearably grim. The castle has stood empty ever since, left to the rats and the wind and the ghosts of its blood-soaked past. For the Nightfort has been home to more atrocities than any castle in the Seven Kingdoms. Its halls have witnessed horrors that would make even hardened warriors lose their nerve. It is a place where apprentice boys face things that came in the night, where Mad Axe walked the yards and climbed the towers to butcher his brothers in the darkness, where brave young Dany Flint was discovered to be a girl and was raped and murdered by her sworn brothers, where King Sherrit called down his curse on the Andals of old. The 79 sentinels met their fate here, sealed in the ice of the wall itself for their desertion. And it was here, in the early years of the Night's Watch, that the 13th Lord Commander committed the acts that earned him eternal damnation in the memory of the North. The story begins, as Old Nan told it to young Bran Stark, during the Age of Heroes, in those semi-mythical years just after the war was completed. The Watch was new then, and the memory of the long night still fresh. Men took their vows seriously, understanding that they stood between humanity and the darkness beyond. The 13th Lord Commander was said to be a warrior of great skill and valor, a man who had proven himself worthy to lead the Black Brothers. One day, while ranging beyond the wall, or perhaps standing watch atop it, the Lord Commander saw a woman approaching through the snow. This was no ordinary woman. Her skin was white as the moon, pale as milk, cold as ice. Her eyes were like blue stars, bright and inhuman. Her touch could freeze living flesh. Everything about her screamed of wrongness, of something that should not exist, that violated the natural order. She was beautiful in the way that frost patterns on glass are beautiful, in the way that death can sometimes be beautiful. But hers was a beauty that inspired dread rather than desire. The Lord Commander should have fled. He should have raised the alarm, called his brothers to arms, recognized this creature for what she was. But instead, he was seized by an obsession that transcended reason. He chased her through the snow, this corpse woman, this creature of ice and death. He caught her, and he gave her his seed. The moment he did, old Nan would say, dropping her voice to a whisper that made the Stark children huddle closer to the fire, he gave her his soul as well. Whatever that woman was, whatever dark magic animated her pale flesh, it claimed him utterly in that moment. He was hers, body and spirit, bound by chains stronger than iron, enslaved by his own desire. The Lord Commander brought his corpse bride back to the Nightfort. He declared himself king and her his queen. Using some terrible sorcery, perhaps taught to him by this ice woman, perhaps flowing from their union, he bound his Night's Watch brothers to his will. These men who had sworn to guard the realms of men became his thralls, unable to resist his commands. The Nightfort became his castle, his kingdom, and for 13 dark years he ruled there with his corpse queen at his side. What happened during those 13 years depends on who tells the story. Some say the Night's King made sacrifices to the others, the White Walkers who dwell in the lands of always winter. He would offer them gifts, tributes paid to dark powers beyond the wall. Some say he practiced terrible sorceries, experimenting with magics that should never be touched by mortal hands. The specifics are lost to time, or perhaps deliberately forgotten, but all accounts agree that atrocities were committed, horrors so profound that they are still whispered about thousands of years later. The rule of the Night's King finally ended when word of his treachery reached the King of Winter in Winterfell and Joramun, the king beyond the wall. Brandon the Breaker, they call him in the histories, that King of Winter who rode north with his warriors. He made common cause with Joramun, setting aside the ancient enmity between the North and the wildlings to confront a threat greater than their old feuds. Together, the armies of the living marched on the Nightfort. The details of that battle are lost to time, consumed by the centuries that have passed. We don't know if the Night's King fought or surrendered, whether he was killed or imprisoned. What became of his corpse queen when the living finally breached the Nightfort's walls? What we do know is that Brandon the Breaker won. The Night's King was defeated, his sorcery broken, the Night's Watch freed from his control. The dark years ended. And then something remarkable happened. Something that tells us as much about the victors as the villain. His name was struck from every record. Whatever he had been called in life, whatever house he had belonged to, whatever titles he had earned before his corruption, all of it was erased. The Night's Watch keeps meticulous records of all its Lord Commanders, chronicling each man who has held that ancient office from the founding of the Order to the present day. But the 13th is listed only by his number. His name is gone, wiped from history as if it never existed, removed from every book and scroll where it might once have been written. Why such thorough erasure? The answer tells us something about how the North remembers and what it chooses to forget. To speak a name gives it power, keeps it alive in memory. To write a name preserves it for all time. Brandon the Breaker and the Night's Watch understood that the Night's King's greatest punishment was not death, but oblivion. He would be remembered only as a warning, a cautionary tale, forever the 13th Lord Commander who fell from grace. His name, his house, his identity before his fall, all of that was taken from him. But here is where the tale becomes even stranger. Old Nan, in her stories to Bran, suggested that the Night's King might have been a Stark. She mentioned, in that way of old women who have lived too long and seen too much, that some say he was a brother of Brandon the Breaker himself, or perhaps even Brandon himself in some versions. A Bolton, a Woodfoot, an Umber, a Flint, a Nori, depending on where the tale is told. The Night's King might belong to any of the great northern houses. This variance in the telling is not corruption of the story, but preservation of an important truth. The Night's King was one of them, one of the great families of the North, a man who should have been above reproach. That is what made his fall so terrible. He was not some weak-willed hedge knight or craven commoner. He was a lord, a warrior, a man of ancient and noble blood who stood as Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and even such a man could be corrupted, could fall victim to dark desires and darker powers. The Maesters, in their Citadel in Old Town, dismissed the Night's King as folklore. Archmaester Harmune recorded the tale in his book, Watchers on the Wall, but even there it is presented as legend rather than history. The Archmaesters generally consider it fiction, though some admit that perhaps an early Lord Commander did try to set himself up as a king. They suggest the Corpse Queen was just a woman, perhaps a daughter of the Barrow King, not the supernatural creature of the tales. They look for rational explanations, ways to strip the story of its fantastic elements and reduce it to understandable history. But they miss the point. Whether the Night's King's bride was truly a creature of ice and dark sorcery, or merely a woman painted in legend's embellishing brush, the core truth remains. A Lord Commander of the Night's Watch betrayed his vows, enslaved his brothers, and ruled from the Nightfort for 13 years before being brought down by an alliance of old enemies. That much is almost certainly historical fact. The supernatural elements, real or imagined, serve to emphasize the depth of his corruption, the fundamental wrongness of what he did. The story also explains certain traditions of the Night's Watch that might otherwise seem strange. The Watch builds no walls on the southern sides of their castles. Any fortress can be entered freely from the south, from the lands they are sworn to protect. This is deliberate, ensuring that if a garrison ever falls to the enemy, that castle cannot be held against an assault from the south. The lack of southern defences is a direct response to the Night's King's takeover of the Nightfort, a safeguard built into every castle's design to prevent history from repeating itself. Think about what it means that this story has survived for 8,000 years or more. The wall was built in the Age of Heroes, and the Night's King reigned shortly after its completion. That puts these events in the deepest reaches of history, times when the First Men still held all of Westeros before the Andals ever crossed the narrow sea. Written records from that era are scarce to non-existent. Everything we know comes from oral tradition, from stories passed down across 300 generations or more. Yet the North remembers. Old women tell their grandchildren about the Night's King. The Night's Watch itself keeps the tradition alive. The cautionary tale of the 13th Lord Commander, who betrayed everything he swore to uphold. Castle Black's Maesters may dismiss the supernatural elements, but they don't dispute that something happened, that a Lord Commander fell and had to be overthrown. The story is too deeply embedded in too many independent traditions to be pure invention. What the Maesters' official histories miss is the profound lesson encoded in this tale. It is not primarily about the supernatural threat of corpse queens and ice sorcery, though that is part of it. It is about the danger of corruption from within, about how even the most trusted leaders can fall, about the necessity of vigilance, not just against the enemy beyond the wall, but against the darkness that can grow in men's hearts. It is about the cost of obsession, the price of betraying your oaths, the consequences that echo across millennia. The Night's King gave his seed to his corpse queen, Old Nan would say, and in doing so, gave her his soul. That is the heart of the story, stripped of all embellishment. He let desire override duty. He chose personal gratification over sacred responsibility. He enslaved his brothers to serve his own ends. And for this, his name was erased, his memory cursed, his existence reduced to a title and a warning. The Maesters don't record this story in their histories because it doesn't fit the neat categories they prefer. It is too mixed with legend, too contaminated by the supernatural, too dependent on oral tradition rather than written accounts. But the North doesn't need the Maesters' validation. The North remembers. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howls beyond the wall and darkness presses close, the stories of the Night's King are told again, keeping the memory alive, ensuring that the Watch will never forget what one of their own became. But if the Nightfort's darkest tale is the Night's King, its most infamous is surely the Rat Cook. This story Bran Stark remembered when he and his companions took shelter in the abandoned castle, and it chilled him more than any tale of ancient Lord Commanders or Corpse Queens. It is a story about revenge, about hospitality, about the terrible price of violating sacred laws. The tale begins, as Bran recalled it from Old Nan's telling, with an Andal king who came to visit the Nightfort. This would place the story sometime after the Andal invasion of Westeros, thousands of years after the Night's King, but still in the deep past. The king's identity changes depending on who tells the tale. Some say it was King Tywald II Lannister. Others insist it was King Oswell I Arryn. The name matters less than what happened during that fateful visit. The king had offended the cook somehow. Bran couldn't remember the exact nature of the offense, and indeed, it seems to vary in the telling. Perhaps the king had wronged the cook personally, or wronged someone the cook loved, or committed some injustice that demanded redress. Whatever the offense, it was grave enough that the cook decided to exact a terrible revenge. The cook killed the king's son. He took the prince, murdered him, and then, with all the skill of his trade, prepared the body. He made a pie, a magnificent pie, and into that pie went the prince's flesh mixed with bacon and onions and all manner of savory ingredients. He baked it to perfection, that pie, decorated it beautifully, let the aroma fill the great hall. When the meal was served, the king ate heartily of the pie. He praised the cook's skill. The taste was so exquisite, the pie so delicious, that he asked for a second helping. The king ate his fill, complimenting the cook on the finest pie he had ever tasted, never knowing that he was consuming his own son's flesh. Now here is where the story takes its crucial turn, where it becomes something more than just a tale of revenge and cannibalism. The gods saw what the cook had done. They looked down upon this violation, this obscenity, and they passed judgment. But their judgment was not for the murder itself. As Bran tells his companions in the Nightfort, as Old Nan had told him, it wasn't for murder the gods cursed the rat cook, or for serving the king's son in a pie. A man has a right to vengeance. The gods cursed the cook not for the killing, not even for making a father eat his own child, horrific as those acts were. They cursed him because he had broken guest right. The king had come to the Nightfort as a guest. By the ancient laws that govern all of Westeros, all of the known world, a guest is sacred. When you accept someone under your roof, when you share bread and salt with them, they are protected by laws more fundamental than any sworn oath, more binding than any treaty. To harm a guest, to murder a guest, is to commit a crime against the gods themselves. And so the cook was transformed. The gods turned him into an enormous white rat, massive beyond any natural vermin. But this was not merely a physical transformation. It was a curse profound and eternal. The rat cook could eat only one thing: his own offspring. He was doomed to feast on his children, generation after generation. He would devour them, but his hunger would never be satisfied. He would remain forever famished, forever consuming the young he himself had created. According to the legend, the rat cook still lives in the Nightfort to this day. That enormous white rat still scurries through the abandoned halls and empty kitchens. All the other rats that infest the Nightfort are his descendants, born to be consumed by their father. The curse ensures an endless supply of offspring, an infinite cycle of birth and cannibalism that will continue until the wall itself falls. The tale of the rat cook became so infamous that it inspired songs still sung throughout the Seven Kingdoms. At the Red Wedding's aftermath, at the wedding of Ramsay Bolton to the false Arya Stark, Lord Wyman Manderley specifically requested that a bard sing about the rat cook. This was not a random choice. Lord Wyman had just served 3 enormous pork pies at the feast. Those pies, as later became clear, contained the flesh of Walder Frey's sons, the men responsible for killing Catelyn Stark and her son Robb at the Red Wedding. Wyman Manderley was enacting his own version of the rat cook's revenge, reminding those present of what happens when guest right is violated. For that is the true lesson of the tale, the reason it has endured for thousands of years and been encoded into song and story. Guest right is sacred. In a world without reliable law enforcement, without police or courts that extend beyond the borders of individual kingdoms, the laws of hospitality provide the only guarantee of safety when traveling. If you can eat bread and salt in a man's home and still be murdered there, then nowhere is safe. Society itself breaks down if guests can be betrayed under the very roofs that should protect them. The rat cook's curse emphasizes this point. The cook's vengeance might have been justified. Perhaps the king truly did commit some terrible wrong that demanded retribution. Perhaps the cook had every right to seek revenge, but he chose to exact that revenge by violating hospitality, by murdering a guest beneath his own roof, and for this the gods showed no mercy. The cook's transformation into a rat is symbolically perfect. Rats are creatures of filth and disease, vermin that infest dark spaces, pests to be hunted and killed. By making the cook a rat, the gods marked him as something beneath contempt, something to be reviled rather than pitied. And by forcing him to consume his own children, they gave him a curse that mirrors his crime. He made a father eat his son. Now he must eat his own sons, forever. The Maesters, predictably, treat this as pure folklore. They might acknowledge that something happened at the Nightfort, that perhaps a cook did poison or kill a visiting king's son, but they dismiss the supernatural elements as embellishment. The transformation into a rat, the eternal curse, the offspring endlessly born to be devoured, all of this they wave away as fantasy, the kind of grim fairy tale meant to frighten children and teach moral lessons. But they are missing something essential. The story's power does not depend on whether there is literally a giant white rat still living in the Nightfort. The power lies in what the tale represents, what it has accomplished across the centuries since it allegedly occurred. Because of the rat cook, because of this story and others like it, guest right remains one of the most sacred laws in Westeros. Even the most brutal lords, the most treacherous schemers, the most ruthless killers, Almost all of them respect guest right. They may plot murder and betrayal in 100 different ways, but they will not strike while someone is under their roof eating their food. The few who do violate this law, like Walder Frey at the Red Wedding, are universally reviled. They may gain temporary advantage from their treachery, but they lose all honor, all respect. They mark themselves as monsters in the eyes of the entire realm. This is not because everyone believes in the literal truth of the rat cook story. Most highborn lords, educated by Maesters, probably consider it a peasant superstition, but the story has done its work regardless. It has encoded into the culture, into the very bones of Westerosi society, a profound respect for the laws of hospitality. It has made the violation of guest right not just a tactical mistake or a dishonorable act, but a crime against the gods themselves, something that will bring down divine retribution. The tale also serves as a warning about revenge. The cook had a grievance, perhaps a legitimate one, but in seeking vengeance, he chose a method so heinous that it damned him. His punishment was not for the desire for revenge itself, which the story acknowledges as understandable, even justified. His punishment was for the method, for allowing his desire for revenge to lead him to break laws that should never be broken. There is a practical wisdom in this, beyond the supernatural elements. Revenge that violates fundamental social contracts doesn't just harm your enemy, it tears at the fabric of society itself. It makes everyone less safe. If men will murder guests beneath their own roofs, then trust becomes impossible. Commerce falters, travel becomes deadly. The bonds that hold civilization together fray and break. The cook's revenge against the king ended up punishing everyone, not just his target. The image of the rat cook endlessly consuming his own offspring also speaks to the self-destructive nature of certain kinds of revenge. The cook's curse traps him in an eternal cycle where he devours his own future, consumes his own legacy. He cannot escape what he has become. He cannot break free of the consequences of his choices. He is locked into a pattern of destruction that perpetuates itself across generations. When Bran tells this story to his companions in the abandoned Nightfort, he is doing what Old Nan did for him, what storytellers have done for thousands of years. He is passing along a warning encoded in memorable form. None of them believe they will encounter a giant white rat in those dark halls, but they all understand what the story means, what it tells them about the world they inhabit and the laws that govern it. The Maesters don't record the tale of the rat cook in their great histories because it is a story of the smallfolk, told by the smallfolk, preserved through oral tradition rather than written document. There are no noble witnesses to confirm it, no official records that survive from that ancient time. It is filed away in their minds as folklore, as one of many colourful stories the common people tell to explain or reinforce social customs. But the story has accomplished something no Maesters treatise could match. It has made the laws of hospitality sacred across an entire continent for thousands of years. It has prevented countless murders, protected countless guests, reinforced the bonds that allow strangers to trust each other enough to build a functioning society. That enormous white rat scurrying through the Nightfort has done more to preserve civilization than all the books in the Citadel. And so the tale endures. It is told in taverns and around campfires. It is sung in halls both great and small. Children are frightened by it and remember the lesson. The rat cook lives on, not necessarily in the flesh, but in memory, and in the laws his story continues to enforce. The Maesters may not record it, but the North remembers. The whole realm remembers. and that remembering keeps everyone a little bit safer. Let us leave the frozen north now and turn our attention to the sea, to those rocky islands where the grey waves crash against black cliffs, and the people claim descent not from the land, but from the depths themselves. The Iron Islands have always stood apart from the rest of Westeros, culturally distinct, religiously unique, proud of their differences from the Greenlands across the bay. Their history is different too, their legends more concerned with the sea than the land. Their heroes measured not by the castles they built, but by the ships they sailed and the raids they conducted. And of all the Iron Islands' legendary figures, none looms larger than the Grey King, the first king of the Iron Islands and the basis for their most cherished myths. The Grey King's story begins in the Age of Heroes, that semi-mythical time when all the great houses of Westeros claim their founders lived. He is called the Grey King because everything about him was grey. His hair was grey, his beard was grey, his eyes were grey as the winter sea, and as he aged, even his skin turned grey. It was as if the sea itself had claimed him, stained him with its colours, marked him as its own. According to the legends told by the Ironborn, the Grey King was chosen by the drowned god, the unique patron deity of the Iron Islands. The drowned god dwells in his watery halls beneath the sea, and from there he watches over those who live by the waves. The Grey King was his champion, blessed with power beyond mortal men, destined to achieve feats that would echo through the ages. The Grey King's greatest accomplishment, the deed that defined his legend, was the slaying of Naga. Now Naga was no ordinary creature. She was the first sea dragon, a monster of impossible size and ferocity. While the dragons of Valyria flew through the air and breathed fire, sea dragons were serpentine creatures that dwelt in the ocean's depths. Naga fed on krakens and whales, as lesser creatures might feed on fish. When she grew angry, she could drown entire islands, pulling them beneath the waves with her thrashing. The Grey King, blessed by the drowned god, rose to confront this terror. The battle between man and monster took place off the coast of Old Wick, one of the Iron Islands. The details of the combat are lost to legend, exaggerated surely in the countless retellings, but all accounts agree that the Grey King fought Naga single-handedly and emerged victorious. He killed the sea dragon, this creature that had terrorized the Isles and fed on the mightiest beasts of the deep. But the Grey King's blessing extended beyond the battle itself. After Naga died, the drowned god worked a miracle. He transformed Naga's bones into stone, preserving them for all time. The Grey King then used these petrified dragon bones to build his hall on Old Wick. This was not a castle of timber or even of quarried stone, but a palace built from the skeleton of a dragon. The ribs formed the walls, massive curved bones arching overhead like the hull of an upturned ship. And somehow, wondrously, Naga's fire remained alive even in death. The Grey King's hall was heated and lit by the living fire of the sea dragon, a flame that never went out, that burned without fuel, sustained by the last remnant of Naga's vitality. This hall, this throne made of Naga's jaws, became the seat of power in the Iron Islands. From there, the Grey King ruled his people, and his accomplishments extended far beyond slaying a dragon. The legends credit him with everything that makes the Ironborn what they are. He built the first longship, that sleek vessel perfectly designed for raiding and warfare. To accomplish this, he had to kill Ig, a demonic tree that fed on human flesh. This was no ordinary timber, but a source of supernatural power, and from it, the Grey King crafted a ship unlike any the world had seen. He taught his people how to make fishing nets, how to weave sails, how to harvest the bounty of the sea. He gave them fire by tricking the storm god, the drowned god's eternal enemy, into striking a tree with lightning, stealing the flame for the benefit of mankind. The Grey King took a mermaid as his wife, and their children could live beneath the waves as easily as on land. This is why the Ironborn claim a special connection to the sea, why they speak of the sea as their true home, why what is dead may never die but rises again harder and stronger is their creed. They are, according to their legends, literally children of the ocean, descended from the Grey King's union with a creature of the depths. For 1,007 years, the Grey King ruled from his hall on Old Wick. He saw generations of men born, live, and die while he endured, grey and immortal, sustained by the drowned god's favour. He warred against the storm god for all those long centuries, an eternal conflict between the patron of the depths and the lord of the air. Finally, in his last years, his skin completed its transformation, turning as grey as his hair and beard had always been. He became something more than human, or perhaps less, something of the sea itself. When the Grey King knew his time was ending, he cast aside his driftwood crown. He walked into the sea, descended into the watery halls of the drowned god, taking his place at the god's right hand, where he sits to this day. After his death, the storm god sought revenge, trying to erase the Grey King's memory. He snuffed out Naga's living fire. The sea itself came to steal the Grey King's throne. Of his magnificent hall, only the bones remain, massive stone ribs jutting from the ground on Old Wick, so large and so strange that they cannot be explained by any natural process the Maesters understand. The Grey King supposedly fathered 100 sons, and when he died, these sons fought each other in brutal conflicts for supremacy. By the time the dust settled and the blood dried, only 16 remained. From these 16, almost all the noble houses of the Iron Islands claim descent. House Greyarn traced their line to the eldest. House Hoare and House Greyjoy both claim the Grey King's blood. The Good Brothers, alone among the great houses, trace their descent not from the Grey King himself, but from his loyal elder brother. Now, the Maesters look at this story and see obvious impossibilities. No man lives for 1,000 years. Sea dragons, if they existed at all, were natural creatures, not monsters that could drown islands or whose bones could be turned to stone. Mermaids are myths. Their fire cannot burn without fuel. And the coincidence of one legendary figure accomplishing every foundational achievement of Iron Island's culture strains credibility. They theorize that the Grey King is a composite figure, an amalgamation of several different historical persons whose deeds were combined into a single legendary hero over centuries of storytelling. Perhaps there was an early king who defeated some large sea creature, and another who taught improved fishing techniques, and another who led raids in a revolutionary new ship design, and, over time, these separate figures blurred together in oral tradition until they became one mythical Grey King. This is reasonable scholarship, the kind of analysis one would expect from educated men, trying to separate history from legend. But it misses what makes the Grey King story important to the Ironborn. Whether or not a historical Grey King existed, whether he slew a sea dragon or lived for a millennium, the legend defines Iron Island's identity in ways that pure history never could. The Grey King represents everything the Ironborn value. everything they aspire to become. He was a raider and warrior, yes, fearsome in battle and victorious against impossible odds. But he was also a teacher and cultural hero, a founder of civilization rather than merely a destroyer. He did not just conquer, he civilized. He gave his people the tools they needed to thrive in their harsh environment, the knowledge to survive and prosper on their rocky islands surrounded by cold grey seas. He was blessed by their God, living proof that the drowned God favors those who live by the old ways, who embrace the sea rather than fear it. His longevity, that 1,007 years of rule, suggests the endurance of Iron Island's culture, their claim to have remained unchanged and uncorrupted by the centuries, to have held fast to their traditions while the green lands around them shifted and changed with each new dynasty. The slaying of Naga is particularly significant symbolically, resonating through Iron Island's culture in ways that shape their identity to this day. The sea dragon represents the ocean's dangers, the terrible power of the waters that surround the Iron Islands and give them both sustenance and constant threat of death. The sea provides fish for eating and trade routes for raiding, but it also brings storms that destroy ships and waves that sweep men overboard, cold that kills the unprepared, and depths that swallow the unwary. By conquering Naga, the Grey King represents human mastery over these dangers, the triumph of mortal will over the killing power of the sea. But crucially, he does not simply kill the dragon and leave its corpse to rot. He transforms its remains into his home, builds his hall from its bones, lights his throne with its fire. This is a perfect metaphor for how the Ironborn relate to the sea, how they have learned not just to survive its dangers, but to thrive because of them. The marriage to a mermaid reinforces this idea. The Ironborn are not separate from the sea, but literally born from it, carrying ocean blood in their veins. This explains their affinity for water, their skill at sailing and swimming, their comfort in an environment that landsmen fear. It justifies their raiding culture by framing it as the natural behavior of a people who are, in essence, predators of the sea. The Grey King's hall, heated by Naga's living fire, represents the idea that the Ironborn have tamed the very forces of nature, bent them to human use. Even a dragon's flame serves them. This is a culture with supreme confidence in their mastery of their environment, and the Grey King legend encodes that confidence in vivid, memorable form. The 100 Sons and their subsequent conflicts represent the fractious nature of Iron Island's politics. The Ironborn have never truly unified under a single authority for long. Even at the height of the kingdom of the Iron Islands, the various houses competed and schemed against each other. The legend of the Grey King's sons killing each other until only 16 remained is not a shameful history to be hidden, but a proud explanation for why the current families deserve their status. They are descended from the survivors, the strongest and most cunning of the Grey King's offspring. The physical evidence that remains on Old Wick deserves examination. There is indeed a structure there, massive curved ribs of stone that local tradition calls Naga's bones. They are enormous, far larger than any whale skeleton, and their composition and formation puzzle Maesters who examine them. They are not fossilized bone as we understand it, but neither are they obviously worked stone. They are simply there, inexplicable, lending credence to legends that would otherwise be dismissed as pure fantasy. Are they actually the petrified bones of a sea dragon? The Maesters say no, proposing various geological explanations for unusual rock formations. but they cannot fully explain them either. The stones remain mysterious, evidence that something happened on Old Wick in the deep past, something that gave birth to legends. The Grey King story also serves a political purpose in the Iron Islands. Because nearly every house claims descent from him, his legend provides a common heritage that unifies the fractious Ironborn. They may fight among themselves, but they are all children of the Grey King, all carrying a piece of that ancient greatness. This shared ancestry, true or not, creates bonds that have kept the Iron Islands culturally distinct from the rest of Westeros for thousands of years. The Maesters don't record the Grey King's tale as history because it clearly isn't, not in the way they understand history. It is legend heavily contaminated by myth, supernatural elements that cannot be verified, fantastic claims that violate known laws of nature. They might include a paragraph about him in their histories of the Iron Islands, noting that the Ironborn claim descent from a legendary king who supposedly ruled for 1,000 years, but they do not treat his story as reliable historical fact. Yet the Grey King is more real to the Ironborn than any Maester's dry chronicle of trade agreements and succession disputes. His story defines who they are, explains where they come from, justifies their way of life. When an Ironborn captain raids the mainland, he is living the legacy of the Grey King, taking from the weak as the strong have always done. When a drowned priest dunks a believer in the sea, he is invoking the power of the god who blessed the Grey King. When House Greyjoy sits on the sea stone chair, carved in the shape of a kraken, they are claiming the mantle of the Grey King's descendants. The tale endures not because historians verify it, but because a people believe it, because it serves their needs, because it contains truths about identity and culture that transcend questions of literal historical accuracy. The Grey King may be myth, but the Ironborn are real, and their reality is shaped by his legend. That is power the Maester's histories cannot match, truth of a different kind than what is written in books. Now we travel from the harsh coasts of the Iron Islands to the fertile heart of Westeros, to the Reach, that most prosperous of the 7 kingdoms where the fields are green and the harvests abundant. The Reach, that most fertile and prosperous of the 7 kingdoms, has its own collection of ancient legends, stories that trace back to the age of heroes and the mythical figure of Garth Greenhand. Garth is claimed as the father of all the great houses of the Reach, a fertility god made flesh who walked the lands in the dawn of days, making crops spring up wherever his feet touched the ground, fathering children with women across the kingdom, teaching the arts of agriculture and civilization. Garth supposedly had many children, and from these children the various noble houses of the Reach claim descent. There was Brandon of the Bloody Blade, Rose of Red Lake, Rowan Goldtree, and many others. But of all Garth's children, none was more cunning, none more clever than his daughter Floris, who earned the epithet the Fox through deeds that would echo through the centuries in whispered stories and scandalous songs. Floris the Fox was beautiful, certainly, as Garth's daughters were said to be, but her true gift was not beauty, but intelligence, a cleverness that surpassed all her siblings. And she used this cleverness to accomplish something that no one before or since has managed, something that sounds impossible, yet is recorded in the genealogies of 3 separate noble houses. Floris kept 3 husbands simultaneously, each ignorant of the other two's existence. Think about what this means, the sheer audacity and skill required to maintain such a deception. This was not a matter of secret affairs or hidden dalliances. Floris was legally married to 3 different men at the same time, lived with each of them, bore sons to each of them, managed separate households and separate lives, and none of the 3 husbands ever discovered the truth. How did she accomplish this? The legends do not provide details, and perhaps it is better that way, allowing imagination to fill in the gaps. We can picture Floris traveling constantly, explaining absences to each husband with plausible stories. We can imagine her carefully managing her time, ensuring she was never in 2 places at once, maintaining separate residences far enough apart that chance encounters were unlikely. We can envision her wit, the quick thinking required to keep her story straight, to remember which husband knew what, to prevent any detail from crossing between her separate lives. The sons she bore to these 3 husbands became founders of noble houses. From one came House Florent, which would become one of the great houses of the Reach, lords of Brightwater Keep, known for their cleverness and their oversized ears, considered a mark of cunning inherited from their ancestress. From another came House Ball. From the third came House Peak. 3 separate bloodlines, 3 separate dynasties, all tracing their descent from Floris and claiming her cleverness as their legacy. In some versions of the tale, Lan the Clever, that legendary trickster who founded House Lannister, was himself a bastard son of Floris or her sister Rowan Goldtree. This connection, if true, would explain where Lan learned the cunning and wit that allowed him to trick the Casterlys out of Casterly Rock. Cleverness might run in the family, inherited from Garth Greenhand through his most brilliant daughter. Now, this story presents certain problems for those who like their history neat and verified. Bigamy was illegal under the laws of the Seven even in ancient times, and surely would have been frowned upon under whatever gods the first men worshipped before the Andals arrived. If Floris's deception was discovered, it would have caused scandal of epic proportions, likely resulting in the annulment of all 3 marriages and the bastardization of all her children. Yet houses Florin, Ball and Peak all proudly claim Floris as their ancestor. Their genealogies acknowledge her 3 marriages. They are not ashamed of how their houses were founded, but instead boast about the cleverness of their forebear. This is particularly true of House Florent, whose members have long been known for their prominent ears, which they claim as a badge of inherited intelligence, a physical reminder of their descent from Floris the Fox. The Maesters, confronted with this legend, have several options. They can dismiss it as complete fiction, a colourful story with no basis in historical fact. They can suggest that Floris existed, but the tale of 3 simultaneous marriages is exaggeration. Perhaps she married 3 times sequentially, and the legend conflated this into simultaneous marriages. They can propose that Floris represents several different women whose stories merged in oral tradition. What the Maesters cannot do is include this story in their official histories. It is scandalous. It involves bigamy, which is illegal. It lacks proper documentation, and it comes from oral tradition rather than written records. The houses that claim descent from Floris are real enough, their genealogies documented in the Citadel's archives, but the colourful details of their founding are filed away as legend, not history. But there is something else at work here, something that explains why this particular story is told in whispers rather than proclaimed in halls. The tale of Floris the Fox is fundamentally subversive. It celebrates a woman who bent the rules, who used her intelligence to accomplish something society would never permit if done openly. It suggests that cleverness and wit can overcome even the strongest social conventions. And it does all this while maintaining plausible deniability, couched as an ancient legend that may or may not be true. Women in Westeros, particularly noble women, have limited power. They are pawns in their houses' political games, married off to forge alliances, expected to produce heirs and otherwise remain in the background. They do not choose their husbands. They do not control their own property. They cannot inherit in most cases. They are, for all practical purposes, property themselves, valuable primarily for their ability to create connections between houses through marriage and children. Flores the Fox represents a kind of feminine power that threatens this entire system. She did not wait to be married off to whoever her father chose. She picked 3 husbands, maintained relationships with all of them, bore sons to each, and managed it all while keeping her secret. She was not controlled. She controlled. She was not property. She was the player moving pieces on the board. And she did it all through cleverness, through the one form of power that cannot be taken away by force. This is why the story endures, particularly among women. Mothers tell their daughters about Flores the Fox, and in that telling pass along a message. Intelligence is power. Wit can overcome restrictions. A clever woman can accomplish things society would never allow openly. The tale is subversive, gently undermining the social order, while pretending to be nothing more than a colourful legend from the age of heroes. Of course, the male descendants of Flores tell the story differently. They emphasize her cleverness while downplaying the subversive elements. To them, Flores represents the cunning of their house, proof that their bloodline is special, blessed with intelligence above the common run of men. They proudly trace their descent from her, while perhaps not dwelling too much on what it meant that she managed to deceive 3 husbands simultaneously. The practical impossibility of Flores's feat is part of what makes it appealing as legend. Could anyone truly manage 3 separate marriages without discovery? In the modern day, almost certainly not. But in the age of heroes, in that semi-mythical past when the distances were greater and communication more difficult, when there were no maesters keeping careful records and no network of ravens carrying information across the kingdom, perhaps it was barely possible. Or perhaps it was impossible, and that is precisely why it became legend, a fantasy of control and autonomy that could never exist in reality. The story also serves as a reminder of how much history is lost, particularly women's history. The Maesters record battles and treaties, the deeds of lords and kings. They document who married whom and which lands changed hands. But the clever maneuvers of women, the subtle power exercised in domestic spheres, the intelligence required to navigate a world where half the population is treated as property, all of this goes largely unrecorded. Flores the Fox exists in legend precisely because women like her could not exist in official history. If a woman was too clever, too independent, too successful at bending the rules, she would be punished for it. Her achievements would be erased or attributed to men. Her name would be stricken from records or twisted into tales of witchcraft and evil. The only safe place for a truly subversive woman is in legend, set so far in the past that she cannot threaten the current order, presented as such an extreme example that she seems fantastical rather than threatening. Yet the message gets through anyway. Clever girls hear about Flores the Fox and learn that intelligence is valued, that wit can be its own form of power. They learn that rules can be bent, systems can be gamed, and sometimes the most effective rebellion is the kind no one even recognizes as rebellion until it is far too late to stop it. The three houses descended from Flory, Florent, Ball, and Pique. All exist in the present day. They are real families with real power, lords of real castles. House Florent in particular has been prominent in recent history, with Selyse Florent marrying Stannis Baratheon and later becoming queen when Stannis claimed the Iron Throne. The Florents boast constantly of having a better claim to Highgarden than House Tyrell, based on their closer blood ties to the extinct House Gardner. This claiming of superior lineage, this insistence on their ancient descent from Garth Greenhand through Flores the Fox, is not mere vanity. It is a political tool, a way of asserting legitimacy and authority. By loudly proclaiming their descent from such a clever ancestress, by making their oversized ears a mark of inherited intelligence rather than a source of shame, House Florent transforms a physical peculiarity into a symbol of their special bloodline. But in doing so, they keep alive the story of Floris and her three husbands. They ensure that the tale continues to be told, passed down through generations, whispered by servants and sung by bards. And through that telling, the subversive message endures, that a woman can be clever enough to deceive everyone, can be powerful enough to control her own destiny, can be bold enough to violate society's most fundamental rules, and not only survive but found dynasties that would endure for thousands of years. The Maesters don't record this story in their histories, not really. They might note that houses Florent, Ball, and Pique all claim descent from a daughter of Garth Greenhand, but they won't include the juicy details about simultaneous marriages and elaborate deceptions. Those elements are too scandalous, too lacking in verification, too dangerous to the social order to be given official sanction. But the story lives on anyway, proving that some truths do not need the Maesters' approval to survive. Some tales endure precisely because they are not official history, because they live in the spaces between what is recorded and what is remembered, because they serve needs that proper history can never address. Flores the Fox may be legend, but the message her story carries is as real as any truth written in the Citadel's books. From the Reach's whispered tales of clever women bending rules they were never allowed to break, let us return north once more, back to Winterfell and the Wall, to a story that exists in a peculiar state of being, both well known and deliberately unrecorded. If you travel beyond the Wall and sit by a wildling fire, if you earn their trust enough that they will share their songs and stories with you, you will eventually hear the tale of Bael the Bard. The free folk sing his song still, hundreds or perhaps thousands of years after his supposed death. They credit him with composing ballads that have become part of their oral tradition, melodies that echo across the frozen wastes and through the camps of those who have never bent the knee to any southern lord. But if you return south and search through the chronicles of Winterfell, if you examine the careful records kept by Maesters across the generations, you will find no mention of Bael at all. His name does not appear. His deeds are not recorded. It is as if he never existed. This erasure is not accidental. The wildlings insist that Bael was real, that his songs prove his existence, that the very blood running through the veins of House Stark carries his legacy. The Maesters and the Lords of Winterfell maintain absolute silence on the matter. This silence itself tells a story, suggests a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge, too dangerous to preserve in writing. For the tale of Bael the Bard, if true, means that every Stark who has ruled Winterfell for perhaps 1,000 years or more descends not from an unbroken line of noble blood, but from a wildling raider, a king beyond the wall, a man who should be their enemy. The story begins as Ygritte told it to Jon Snow during their time together with an insult. Lord Brandon Stark, the ruler of the North in those distant days, called Bael, the Bard, a coward. The exact context of this insult is lost, the reason forgotten. But words matter, especially when spoken by a lord about a man who makes his living through reputation and daring. Bael was at that time not yet a king, but a raider, one of the free folk who crossed the wall to steal and fight and prove their courage against the soft southerners who hid behind their castles and their laws. To answer this insult, to prove that he was no coward, Bael did something that should have been impossible. He climbed the wall, that frozen barrier, 700 feet of ice raised by magic in the Age of Heroes, guarded by the Night's Watch, supposedly impregnable. Bael scaled it alone. He descended on the southern side and took the King's Road south to Winterfell. And there, he did not arrive as a raider with weapons drawn, but as a singer, calling himself Sigeric of Skargos. The name itself was a message for those who understood the old tongue, for Sigeric means deceiver. He announced his deception even as he performed it, a private joke that must have amused him greatly. Lord Brandon Stark received this singer into his hall. Winterfell, in those days, as now, was a place of harsh winters and long memories, but also of northern hospitality. A singer was welcome, a bringer of news and songs from distant places, entertainment during the dark months when the cold pressed close. Bael sang for Lord Brandon, and he sang beautifully, performing until midnight, his voice filling the great hall with ballads of heroes and tragedies, of love and war, and all the themes that stir the human heart. Lord Brandon was impressed, deeply impressed by the skill and artistry he had witnessed. He asked the singer to name his reward, to choose what payment he would accept for the entertainment he had provided. This was an honourable gesture, the kind of magnanimous offer a great lord makes when he has been truly moved by performance or service. Bael's request was modest, almost humble. He asked only for the most beautiful flower blooming in Winterfell's gardens. In the glass gardens of Winterfell, where hot springs from deep beneath the earth keep the air warm, even in the depths of winter, the blue winter roses were just blooming. These flowers, delicate and beautiful, with petals the colour of frost and ice, are special to the north. They grow nowhere else, surviving in Winterfell's protected gardens, when all the world outside is frozen and dead. Lord Brandon had one of these roses cut and presented to the singer, a single perfect bloom, payment for a night of song. The following morning, Lord Brandon's daughter was gone. His only child, his maiden daughter, the sole heir to Winterfell and House Stark, had vanished from her chambers. In her bed, placed carefully where she should have been sleeping, was the blue winter rose that Lord Brandon had given the singer. The message was clear, impossible to misinterpret. Bael the Bard had taken the flower he had truly wanted, and he had left the literal rose as a mocking reminder of his audacity. Lord Brandon sent searchers, of course. He called upon the Night's Watch, commanded them to scour the lands beyond the wall, to find this raider and return his daughter. The Black Brothers flew forth by the hundreds, spreading across the frozen wilderness, searching every camp and cave and hidden valley where wildlings might hide. They questioned the free folk, threatened and bargained, and followed every rumour and hint. They searched for nearly a year, these men in black, combing through territories they barely knew, seeking two people who seemed to have vanished as completely as morning mist. They found nothing. No trace of Bael, no sign of Lord Brandon's daughter. The rangers returned to their castles empty-handed. Their mission failed. In Winterfell, Lord Brandon fell ill. The strain of his daughter's loss, the approaching extinction of his house, the failure of all his efforts, all of this weighed upon him until he took to his bed, waiting to die. The line of Starks, stretching back thousands of years to Brandon the Builder himself, seemed doomed to end with this Brandon, the daughterless, the last of his house. Then, one night, as the dying lord lay in his chambers, he heard something unexpected. A child's cry, the wail of an infant, echoing through the castle. He followed the sound, though he was weak and sick, compelled by hope he did not dare name. The cry led him to his daughter's bedchamber. There she was, returned as mysteriously as she had vanished, sitting in her bed with an infant at her breast, a baby boy nursing peacefully. The shocking truth emerged then, the revelation that made Lord Brandon understand the full extent of Bael's audacity and cleverness. His daughter and Bael had never left Winterfell at all. While the Night's Watch searched beyond the wall, while rangers scoured the frozen wilderness, while Lord Brandon languished in his grief, the wildling and the Stark maiden had been hiding in the crypts beneath the castle. Those ancient tombs stretching deep into the earth, filled with the stone likenesses of dead Starks and their guardian direwolves, had provided perfect sanctuary. No one thought to search there. No one imagined that a thief would hide in the very heart of what he had stolen from. For nearly a year, Bael and Brandon's daughter lived in the darkness beneath Winterfell, in the company of the dead, as the world above searched frantically for them. And in that year, the daughter fell in love with the bard. Or perhaps she had loved him from the first moment she saw him performing in her father's hall. She bore his child willingly, a son, a bastard child of wildling and Stark blood. Bael left this child as payment for the rose he had taken, the wildling's way of balancing the scales, and then he disappeared, climbing back over the wall to return to his people beyond. The boy grew up in Winterfell, legitimized as a Stark because there was no alternative. Lord Brandon had no other heirs, no sons or brothers or nephews who could continue the line. The wildling's bastard became Lord Stark, took the name and the titles and the ancient seat of the kings of Winter. Every Stark who came after, if this tale is true, carries Bael's blood in their veins, descends from that union in the crypts of Winterfell. The story does not end there, though. 30 years passed, and Bael rose to become king beyond the wall, uniting the free folk under his leadership, as so many have tried and failed to do across the ages. He led his people south, bringing an army across the wall to raid the north, as wildling kings had done before. And at the frozen ford, he met his son in battle, the boy he had left behind now grown to be Lord Stark, leading northern forces against the wildling invasion. Father faced son across the battlefield. The wildling king looked upon the man who carried his blood, who ruled from Winterfell, who commanded armies in the name of House Stark, and Bael the Bard, that legendary raider who had proven his courage by stealing into the heart of the North and taking Lord Brandon's only daughter, could not bring himself to kill his own son. He allowed Lord Stark to strike him down, chose death rather than kinslaying. Lord Stark brought his father's head back to Winterfell as a trophy. He displayed it as proof of his victory, evidence that the wildling threat had been ended. His mother, Bael's lover, the Stark maiden, who had hidden in the crypts and borne a wildling's child, saw what her son had done. The head of the man she had loved, separated from his body, displayed for all to see. The grief and horror overwhelmed her. She climbed to the top of a tower and threw herself from it, choosing death over a world where her son had killed his father and displayed the trophy proudly. The son, that Lord Stark who carried both Stark and wildling blood, eventually met his own end at the hands of the Boltons. Those details are vague, lost to time, but the implication is clear. The house descended from Bael's union with the Stark maiden continued. Other children must have been born, the line persisted. House Stark survived to rule the North for another 1,000 years or more. And if the wildlings are correct, every generation since has carried the blood of Bael the Bard. Now, here is where the story becomes even more interesting, where we must examine not just what is told, but what is not told, what is present in the silences and the erasures. Jon Snow, raised at Winterfell, educated by Maester Luwin and entertained by Old Nan, had heard of Bael the Bard as a name, as a figure in wildling history, a king beyond the wall from the ancient past. But he had never heard this particular story, this tale of infiltration and seduction, of hiding in the crypts and founding a dynasty. It was only when Ygritte told him the legend that Jon learned the full tale. Why would Winterfell not preserve this story? Why would it not appear in the chronicles that Maesters keep so carefully? Jon Snow, hearing it for the first time, immediately declared it a lie. The timeline made no sense. The story called the Stark ruler Lord Brandon, not King Brandon, suggesting it happened after Aegon's conquest, when the Starks gave up their crown. It mentioned Bael travelling the King's Road, but the King's Road was built during King Jaehaerys I's reign, decades after the conquest. Yet it also claimed Bael's son was eventually flayed by the Boltons, and the Boltons supposedly gave up that practice 1,000 years before Aegon ever flew his dragons to Westeros. These inconsistencies could mean the story is invention, a wildling myth with no basis in fact. But they could also mean something else. They could indicate that the tale has been passed down for so long through oral tradition that the details have shifted and changed with each telling. The original events might have occurred in the Age of Heroes, with Brandon a king of winter, but over centuries of retelling, the details were updated, made contemporary to each generation of storytellers. The King's Road was inserted because singers forgot there was a time before it existed. The title of king became lord because the free folk no longer remembered that the Starks once wore crowns. The absence of the story from Winterfell's records tells its own truth. If Bael never existed, if this was pure invention, the chronicles would not need to omit him. His absence would be natural, unremarkable. But the wildlings insist he existed, claim his songs as part of their heritage, credit him with deeds and compositions that are still performed beyond the wall. The Maesters acknowledge this in their own writings, noting that the wildlings claim Bael was real, but that Winterfell's chronicles say nothing of him. That silence is deliberate. Think about what it would mean for House Stark to acknowledge this story. It would mean admitting that their noble bloodline, stretching back to the Age of Heroes, was broken by a wildling raider. It would mean acknowledging that every Stark since Lord Brandon the Daughterless descends from the free folk, carries the blood of those who refuse to kneel. For a house whose strength comes from their ancient lineage, whose legitimacy rests on their claim to be the blood of the first men and the kings of winter, this would be devastating. Better to erase it entirely. Better to let the wildlings keep their songs while maintaining absolute silence on the matter. Neither confirm nor deny, simply refuse to acknowledge that the story exists. Over generations, this silence becomes its own form of truth. The absence in the record says, "We do not speak of this." It says, "This is a shame too great to admit." It says, "The story might be true, and that is precisely why it cannot be recorded." There is also a practical reason for this erasure. Throughout the history of the North, the Starks have fought the wildlings, defended the wall, supported the Night's Watch in keeping the free folk beyond the barrier. How could they justify this if they acknowledged their own descent from a wildling king? How could northern lords be expected to follow the Starks in battle against raiders from beyond the wall if everyone knew the Starks themselves carried that same blood? The story serves another purpose for the wildlings. Beyond historical record or entertainment, it is a challenge to southern notions of blood purity and noble superiority. The wildlings, dismissed by southerners as savages and criminals, can point to this tale and say, "Your greatest house, your lords of Winterfell, they descend from one of us. Your noble blood is mixed with ours. You are not as high as you claim, and we are not as low as you think." This is subversive in the same way Floris the Fox's tale is subversive, challenging the social order through story. But where Floris's story subverts gender expectations, Bael's story subverts the rigid class distinctions between the civilized South and the savage wildlings. It suggests that the difference between them is not as great as either side would like to believe. The Maesters cannot record this story because it undermines too many foundational beliefs of Westerosi society. It questions noble bloodlines, challenges the distinction between free folk and kneelers, casts doubt on the legitimacy of one of the oldest and most respected houses in the Seven Kingdoms. Better to categorize it as wildling folklore, to note in their books that the free folk claim Bael existed while emphasizing that Winterfell's chronicles do not confirm this, leaving readers to draw their own conclusions. But in refusing to record it properly, in maintaining that deliberate silence, the Maesters and the Starks inadvertently confirm that the story has power, that it contains truths dangerous enough to suppress. A completely false tale would not require such careful omission. The silence is not the absence of a story, but the presence of a secret too important to acknowledge. And so, the tale of Bael the Bard and the Blue Rose of Winterfell lives on in two forms. Beyond the wall, it is sung proudly, proof of wildling cleverness and courage, evidence that even the mightiest lords can be fooled by one clever man with a talent for music and deception. South of the wall, it exists only in whispers and omissions, in what is carefully not said, in chronicles that mention Bael, only to note that the wildlings claim he existed while Winterfell stays silent. Mance Rayder understood the power of this story. He visited Winterfell twice disguised as a singer, deliberately echoing Bael's infiltration. The first time he came to see King Robert Baratheon's visit, satisfying his curiosity about the Southern King. The second time, he returned calling himself Abel, an anagram of Bael, to rescue who he thought was Arya Stark. In doing so, he paid homage to the legend, acted it out again, proving that the tale still had relevance, still could inspire action centuries or millennia after the original events supposedly occurred. The story also serves as a shadow of another tale, a parallel to events that would happen thousands of years later. A prince who loves songs, a Stark maiden associated with blue winter roses, a romance that had to be hidden, a child born in secret whose true parentage would be concealed. Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The story of Bael and his stolen rose echoes forward through time, suggesting that history repeats itself, that the patterns persist even as the specific players change. Whether Bael the Bard truly existed, whether he really stole into Winterfell and hid in the crypts with Lord Brandon's daughter, whether the Starks really descend from wildling blood, these questions cannot be answered with certainty. The evidence is contradictory, the timeline confused, the truth buried beneath layers of legend and deliberate omission. But the story endures because it serves purposes beyond simple historical record. It challenges assumptions, questions legitimacy, preserves wildling pride, and reminds everyone that the line between savage and civilized, between noble and common, between enemy and ancestor, is thinner than we like to admit. The Maesters don't record it, but that non-recording is itself a kind of record. The silence speaks volumes. And beyond the wall, around fires in the frozen darkness, the wildlings still sing Bael's songs, still tell the tale of the bard who proved his courage by stealing the most beautiful flower from Winterfell's gardens. They know the truth that Winterfell will not acknowledge. Sometimes the stories that are not written down are the most important ones of all. The Nightfort, as we have seen, is home to more dark tales than perhaps any castle in Westeros. The Night King and the Rat Cook are merely the most famous of the horrors said to have occurred within its black walls. But there are others, lesser known perhaps, but no less haunting. Stories that old Nan told, and that are whispered by men of the Night's Watch, when they stand their lonely watches in the deep of night. There is the tale of Dany Flint, young and brave and ultimately doomed. In a world where the Night's Watch accepts any man who comes to take the black, regardless of his past crimes or his noble birth or his lack thereof, women are explicitly forbidden. The Watch is meant to be celibate, and though that rule is often honoured more in the breach than the observance when it comes to the wildling women beyond the wall, the brothers themselves are all meant to be men. Dany Flint wanted to serve. Perhaps she was fleeing an unwanted marriage, or escaping poverty, or running from some other fate that awaited her as a woman in Westeros. Whatever her reasons, she disguised herself as a boy and took the black, travelling to the Nightfort to begin her service. And for a time, the deception worked. She trained alongside the other recruits, did her duties, took her vows. But eventually, her secret was discovered. What happened next is not detailed in the stories, left vague, perhaps because the truth is too ugly to speak plainly. She was raped. She was murdered. Her death was not quick or merciful, and it was her sworn brothers, the men she had trained with and lived beside, who committed these crimes against her. Dany Flint has become a ghost story now, a sad tale told to remind the Night's Watch of a shameful chapter in their history. Some say her spirit still haunts the Nightfort, wandering the halls in her black cloak, searching for justice that never came. But the real horror of Dany Flint's story is not supernatural. It is the brutality of men who saw a woman where they expected only brothers and responded with violence rather than mercy. Then there are the 79 sentinels, deserters from the Night's Watch, who met a fate that makes execution seem merciful. These men abandoned their posts and fled the Nightfort, seeking refuge in the lands to the south. Lord Ryswell, father of one of the deserters, captured them all, and sent them back to face justice. But they were not simply executed and buried. Instead, they were sealed into holes in the wall itself, placed alive into crevasses in the ice, and left there to freeze and suffocate. Their bodies remain there still, frozen sentinels standing their watch in death as they refuse to in life. When the wind blows through the wall, some say you can hear their moaning, their eternal punishment for the crime of desertion. Mad Axe is another name from the Nightfort's dark past. A ranger of the Night's Watch, he went insane for reasons never explained. Perhaps it was the isolation, the endless cold, the things he saw beyond the wall. Perhaps there was no reason at all, just madness striking like a disease. Whatever the cause, Mad Axe took his namesake weapon and began stalking through the Nightfort, methodically murdering his brothers. He killed them in the yards and in the halls. He climbed the towers to reach men who thought themselves safe. He butchered his way through the garrison, and the confusion and terror of his rampage meant he killed many before being stopped. The details of how many died and how Mad Axe himself was finally brought down are lost. But his name endures as a reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from beyond the wall, but from within, from men who break under the strain of their service. Simeon Star Eyes is a figure from the Age of Heroes, a legendary knight who was said to have continued fighting even after losing his eyes. He replaced them with sapphires that could somehow still see, becoming the Knight of the Star Eyes. At the Nightfort, according to legend, he witnessed hellhounds fighting. What these hellhounds were, whether they were literal demonic canines or metaphorical representations of some other horror, is not explained. But the image endures. A blind knight with sapphires for eyes watching infernal creatures battle in the yards of the Nightfort. King Sherrit called down a curse on the Andals from the Nightfort, though the details of this curse are lost. Sherrit himself might be the same as King Sherrick of the Barrowlands, or he might be a different figure entirely, another name lost to time. But the idea that the Nightfort was a place where ancient kings could call down supernatural retribution on their enemies adds to its sinister reputation. There is mention of the thing that came in the night, which apprentice boys faced at the Nightfort. What this thing was is never explained, left deliberately vague to be more frightening. Was it a White Walker that somehow penetrated south of the wall? Was it a monster from the haunted forest? Was it something else entirely, some creature or entity unique to the Nightfort itself? The story does not say, leaving each listener to imagine their own horror. 300 years before Aegon's conquest, the commanders of the Nightfort and Snowgate went to war with each other. This internal conflict within the Night's Watch, brother fighting brother over some dispute now forgotten, led to both commanders being executed by the Starks for betraying their vows. The betrayal was not abandoning the Watch, but using it as a tool for personal conflict, prioritizing their feud over their duty. These stories, and many others like them, form a tapestry of horror surrounding the Nightfort. They explain why, even before it was officially abandoned, the castle had such a dark reputation. They explain why Queen Alysanne, who rode her dragon and faced dangers most people could never imagine, found the Nightfort so unpleasant that she convinced the Night's Watch to abandon it. They explain why, when Bran Stark and his companions seek shelter in the abandoned castle, Bran is frightened by Old Nan's stories even though he is trying to be brave. The Maesters, in their histories of the Night's Watch, might note that the Nightfort was the oldest and largest castle on the wall, that it was abandoned 200 years ago, that it had a reputation for being haunted. But they will not dwell on the specific stories, the individual horrors that gave the castle its reputation. These tales are too sensational, too dependent on oral tradition, too lacking in verifiable sources. Yet these stories serve a purpose beyond simple entertainment or attempts to frighten. They are warnings, encoded in memorable form. Danny Flint's tale reminds the Watch that women disguised as men have tried to join before and met terrible ends, warning potential imitators of the danger. The 79 Sentinels demonstrate that desertion will be punished not just with death, but with eternal shame. Mad Axe shows that isolation and stress can break even strong men, a warning to watch for signs of madness in oneself and one's brothers. These are not pointless scary stories, but practical lessons disguised as legend. They teach history through horror, ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, pass along institutional knowledge in forms that are impossible to forget. A young recruit to the Night's Watch might not remember all the specific regulations he is taught, but he will remember Danny Flint, and he will know to be wary of anyone who seems not quite what they appear. He will remember Mad Axe and watch for signs of madness in the long dark. He will remember the deserters in the ice and think twice before abandoning his post. This is the genius of oral tradition, the reason these stories survive where written instructions might be lost or ignored. A lecture about the importance of following rules is forgotten. A horror story that makes your blood run cold stays with you forever. The Nightfort's tales have kept the Night's Watch more disciplined, more alert, more cognizant of its own history than any written code of conduct could have managed. And there is another function these stories serve. They provide continuity. The Night's Watch has existed for 8,000 years or more, an institution older than any kingdom, older than any noble house, older than almost anything else in Westeros. How does an organization maintain its identity across such vast stretches of time? Part of the answer is stories. The new recruits hear about the Night's King and the Rat Cook, about Danny Flint and Mad Axe, about all the legends and horrors of the Nightfort. In hearing these stories, they connect to brothers who served thousands of years ago. They understand that they are part of something ancient and important, that their service continues a tradition stretching back to the Age of Heroes. The stories make them part of a continuum, links in a chain that extends from the legendary past into an uncertain future. The Maesters, focused on documentation and verification, miss this function of oral tradition. They see only unreliable folklore where there is actually a sophisticated system for maintaining institutional memory and identity across millennia. They categorize these tales as superstition, where there is actually practical wisdom. They dismiss them as entertainment, where there is actually education of the most effective kind. The stories of the Nightfort and the countless other tales whispered among the Night's Watch and the people of the North are not recorded in the Citadel's great books. They live instead in memory, passed from one generation to the next, evolving slowly with each telling but maintaining their essential truths. They are history of a different kind, knowledge preserved through narrative rather than documentation. And perhaps that is why they endure where so much else is forgotten. Books can burn, libraries can be destroyed, written records can be lost or deliberately erased. But a story, once it takes root in the memory of a people, becomes nearly impossible to destroy. It changes, certainly, adapting to new circumstances and new tellings. But it survives. It persists. It continues to teach its lessons and provide its warnings generation after generation, century after century, through changes of dynasty and religion and social structure. The Nightfort stands empty now, abandoned to the rats and the wind. But its stories live on, carried in the memories of the Night's Watch and the smallfolk of the north. The Maesters don't record them, don't preserve them in their archives, don't consider them worthy of scholarly attention. Yet these tales have outlasted kingdoms, survived the collapse of civilizations, endured through 8,000 years of history. That alone should suggest they contain truths worth preserving, wisdom worth heeding, knowledge that cannot be captured in formal histories, but nonetheless shapes the world in profound ways. We have journeyed tonight through tales the Maesters don't record, stories that live in oral tradition rather than written history. We have heard of the Night's King and his corpse queen, of the rat cook transformed into an eternal devourer of his own offspring, of the Grey King who slew Naga and ruled for 1,000 years, of Flores the fox and her impossible feat of juggling 3 husbands, of Bael the bard who hid in Winterfell's crypts, of the various horrors that haunt the Nightfort's abandoned halls. These are strange tales, certainly, filled with supernatural elements and fantastic claims that strain credibility. So why do they matter? Why should we care about stories the learned men of the Citadel dismiss as folklore? The answer lies in understanding what history is and what it does. The Maesters believe history is the recording of factual events, the preservation of what actually happened. They strive for accuracy, for verification, for truth in the narrow sense of correspondence to reality. This is valuable work, certainly. We need records of battles and treaties, genealogies and dates, the mechanics of how the world functions. But there is another kind of truth, another function of historical narrative that the Maesters' approach misses. Stories encode wisdom. They teach lessons. They preserve cultural knowledge. They maintain identity. They provide warnings. They inspire courage. They explain why things are the way they are. And they do all of this in forms that are memorable, emotional, and effective in ways that dry, factual accounts can never match. Consider the story of the rat cook. Is it literally true that a cook was transformed into a giant white rat, cursed to eat his own children? Almost certainly not. The Maesters are probably correct to dismiss the supernatural elements. But the story has kept guest rights sacred across an entire continent for thousands of years. It has prevented countless murders. It has provided a basis for trust between strangers that makes commerce and diplomacy possible. The tale's impact on the world has been immense and positive, regardless of whether the events it describes actually occurred. This is truth of a different kind than what the Maesters seek. It is truth in the sense of efficacy, truth measured by results rather than correspondence to historical fact. A story that is historically false can nonetheless be culturally true, can contain and transmit real wisdom, can shape behavior in beneficial ways. The rat cook is more valuable to Westeros as a legend than it would be as a verified historical account, stripped of its supernatural elements and reduced to a footnote about guest right violations. The same principle applies to all the stories we have discussed tonight. The Night's King legend teaches about corruption from within, about how even the most trusted can fall, about the need for vigilance and accountability. The Grey King story provides identity and cultural continuity to the Iron Islands, explaining who the Ironborn are and why they live as they do. Flores the Fox offers a subversive message about feminine power and intelligence. The various Nightfort tales encode practical wisdom for the Night's Watch in memorable horror story form. These stories also serve as repositories for knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The Maesters focus on the present and the recent past, on events within living memory or well documented in written records. But oral tradition can reach back much further, preserving information from the deep past through generations of retelling. Is every detail accurate after thousands of years of transmission? Of course not. Stories change in the telling, embellishments are added, details are forgotten or confused. But the core elements often survive, the essential truths that made the story worth remembering in the first place. And sometimes, as with Old Nan's tales of the White Walkers, the oral tradition preserves truths that the educated scholars have dismissed as impossible. This should make us reconsider what we mean by historical knowledge. The Maesters would have us believe that only verified, documented history is worth preserving, that everything else is mere superstition to be outgrown as we become more civilized and educated. But this dismisses thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, reduces rich and complex cultural traditions to the status of ignorant folklore. The reality is more nuanced. Written history and oral tradition serve different functions, preserve different kinds of knowledge, excel at different tasks. Written records are better for precise dates and specific details, for complex genealogies and intricate chains of events. Oral tradition is better for long-term preservation, for encoding practical wisdom in memorable form, for maintaining cultural identity and continuity. An ideal approach would value both, recognizing that they complement rather than contradict each other. The Maesters' histories provide the framework, the documented timeline of events. The smallfolk stories fill in the human dimension, the lessons learned, the meaning of those events to the people who live through them. But in Westeros, as in our own world, there is a class dimension to this divide. Written history is the province of the educated elite, the nobles and maesters, who have access to books and the literacy to read them. Oral tradition belongs to the smallfolk, the common people who preserve their own history in the only way available to them. When the Maesters dismiss these stories as mere folklore, they are implicitly dismissing the knowledge and wisdom of the common people, declaring that only the histories written by and for the elite are worth preserving. This is both arrogant and short-sighted. The smallfolk are the ones who actually do most of the work in Westeros, who farm the fields and build the castles and fight the wars that the nobles start. Their accumulated experience, their practical wisdom, their understanding of how the world really works for ordinary people. This is valuable knowledge that deserves to be preserved. The fact that it comes in the story form rather than formal historical documents does not make it less true or less important. Moreover, the smallfolk are often closer to events than the nobles who record them in official histories. A maester in a castle knows what his lord tells him, knows what arrives in official correspondence, knows what can be verified through proper channels. A peasant in a village knows what actually happened, what the soldiers really did, what the battle looked like from the ground, what the policies meant for ordinary people trying to survive. These are different perspectives, different kinds of knowledge, and we need both to understand the full truth of any historical event. The Maesters' histories tell us who won the battle and what lands changed hands. The smallfolk stories tell us what the battle meant to the people who fought it, and the people who survived it, and the people who had to rebuild afterward. The stories we have explored tonight also remind us that history is not just about the great lords and their doings, despite what the Maesters' focus might suggest. History is also made by cooks and nurses, by common soldiers and fisherfolk, by all the ordinary people whose names are never recorded, but whose lives and choices shape the world just as surely as any king's decision. The rat cook was not a nobleman but a servant, yet his story has endured for thousands of years and continues to influence behavior across the entire continent. Old Nan was a servant in Winterfell, illiterate and ancient, yet her stories preserved knowledge about the White Walkers that proved more accurate than all the learned treatises of the Citadel. Dany Flint was nobody, a girl trying to escape whatever fate awaited her, yet her tragedy became a cautionary tale that has influenced Night's Watch policy for generations. These are people the Maesters' histories would ignore or reduce to statistics. But their stories matter, their knowledge matters, their experiences matter, and the fact that their wisdom is preserved in oral tradition rather than written documents does not make it less valuable. As we close tonight, I want you to think about the stories you carry with you, the tales your family tells, the legends of your own community. These might not be written in any book, might not be verified by scholars, might contain elements that could not possibly be literally true, but that does not mean they are worthless. Those stories encode knowledge, preserve wisdom, maintain identity. They are your history, the real history of real people, just as valid and important as anything written in official records. The Maesters don't record these strange tales of Westeros because they don't fit the narrow definition of history that learned men prefer. But the tales endure anyway, passed from memory to memory, generation to generation, carrying forward truths that written words could never quite capture. They are the whispered history of a people, the folklore of a continent, the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who found that the best way to preserve what they knew was to wrap it in a story worth remembering. So when someone dismisses a story as just folklore or mere superstition, remember the tales we have discussed tonight. Remember that Old Nan's supposedly silly stories about White Walkers turned out to be true. Remember that the Rat Cook's legend has kept guest right sacred for millennia. Remember that the Grey King's tale has maintained Iron Island's identity across vast stretches of time. Remember that Flores the Fox's story has carried a subversive message about feminine power for thousands of years. Stories matter. Memory matters. The history that is whispered matters just as much as the history that is written, and perhaps more, because it survives where parchment burns and libraries crumble. The Maesters don't record these tales, but the people do, in the only archive that truly endures, the collective memory of a culture, preserved in narrative, passed forward in hope and warning to all who come after. The fire burns low now, friends, and our night's journey through the strange tales the Maesters don't record must come to an end. We have walked together through the dark halls of the Nightfort, listened to the legends of the Iron Islands, heard the whispered scandals of the Reach. We have seen how oral tradition preserves truths that official histories miss, how the wisdom of the smallfolk endures across millennia, how stories encode knowledge in forms that survive when written records fail. These tales we have explored tonight are not in the Citadel's great books, not preserved in formal histories, not verified by learned men in their chains of office. Yet they live on, carried in the memories of common people, told around fires and in taverns, sung by bards and whispered by nurses. They endure because they matter, because they serve needs that dry historical accounts cannot address, because they contain truths deeper than simple factual accuracy. The next time you hear someone dismiss a story as folklore or superstition, I hope you will pause and consider what wisdom might be encoded in that tale, what warning it might carry, what truth it might preserve. History is not just what the scholars choose to record. History is also what the people remember, what they deem important enough to pass along, what they wrap in narrative and preserve across generations. Thank you for joining me tonight on this exploration of the forgotten and the whispered, the legendary and the strange. If you enjoyed this journey through tales the Maesters ignore, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories to explore, so many more corners of Westeros to examine, so many more whispered truths to uncover. Until next time, friends, may you remember that truth comes in many forms, that wisdom lives in unexpected places, and that the most important stories are often the ones that are never written down. The Maesters keep their histories in the Citadel, but the people keep their own histories in memory and song. Both are necessary, both are real, both deserve to be heard. Good night.